monitoring portion of the California red-legged frog conservation introduction in Yosemite National Park.
Great, welcome. Michelle. Hello, is Michelle Christman joining us today?
I'm here. Can you hear me? Oh,
yeah.
Can you hear me? Okay, you can hear me now?
Yeah. Introduce yourself, please.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, so my name is Michelle Christman, and before I introduce myself, I just want to say that it's really great to be here and be part of this symposium, and I'd really like to thank Luis for all his work in organizing and facilitating and making this happen. I think it's really great to have a venue to synthesize and share information on the state of amphibian translocations, especially so people can, find the resources and capitalize on the successes and lessons learned from other people. Anyway, so a shout out to Luis and thank you. So again, my name is Michelle Christman, and I am with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the Federal Coordinator for PARC, Partners in Amphibian Reptile Conservation. So for those of you who are not familiar with PARC, we are an inclusive, non-affiliated partnership, and we're dedicated to the conservation of amphibians, reptiles, and their habitats. So we have a diverse network of people from state and federal agencies, NGOs, universities, zoos, aquarium, industry, and a whole bunch of others. And our mission is forging new partnerships to conserve amphibians, reptiles, in the places they live. So prior to recently taking this position as the federal coordinator for PARC, I was an endangered species biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I was in ecological services in New Mexico, and I was the species lead for several herp species where we used a variety of translocation techniques for conservation and recovery. So thanks, I'm glad to be here.
Oh, welcome. Sally, Wren, let's hear from you.
Hi, my name's Sally, and I'd say I completely agree with Michelle. Thanks, Luis, for organising this. It's been a real pleasure hearing from all the different projects, and yeah, being able to draw all that information together is so valuable. So thanks so much for organising. And then on me, I'm a programme officer with the Amphibian Specialist Group. So I'm the point person within the ASG for a number of topics, but including captive breeding and reintroductions, and I also do conservation planning. So I've been involved with reviewing the recent amphibian reintroduction guidelines through that, and developing the AArk chapters on those subjects. And then more personally, I'm also finishing up a PhD at the minute, which has involved several bits on translocation. So looking at successes of translocated frog species here in New Zealand, and looking at different situations and where it's been successful and where it hasn't and why that might be. So I've also got that personal experience with translocations.
Fantastic, welcome around. Luis, why don't you introduce yourself in case there's people listening that haven't heard some of the earlier ones.
Sure. I'm Luis Carrillo. I'm the training officer for the AmphibianArk. I have been working with AmphibianArk for the last 5 years, and a little bit longer volunteering with them in Latin America. And my duty is identify training gaps or training needs, and then organize training workshops in place. And this is the first time we do a large online training, but it has been really good. And I'm just taking the advantage and saying there were people from a lot of countries. So Bolivia, US, Guatemala, Colombia, Panama, El Salvador, Peru, England, Canada, even people from Venezuela, Mexico, Chile, Singapore. So we're kind of represented everywhere. So I'm really glad this has been for me a successful workshop or training.
Great. Great. So I'm Joe Mendelson, and I'll mirror the others that thank you for this for this particular program, Luis. This has been really innovative and clearly very successful. So I'm Joe Mendelson. I'm the science advisor for Amphibian AArk, and I'm the director of research at Zoo Atlanta, and I'm on the faculty in biology at Georgia Institute of Technology. And my involvement in amphibian conservation goes a long way back. Mostly focused on disease spread in Latin America and policy making globally and in the US, and red listing and other stuff I can't remember right now, and then captive breeding programs primarily through the informing ACAP and also Amphibian AArk. So I thought what we would do is have kind of a balance. I'll be your moderator today. Have a bit of a balance between a structured approach and then open questions. So what I'm going to do is go around to each of the persons who just introduced themselves and ask them to first give their thoughts on the presentations that they watched. Except for Luis, I don't think any of us were able to see all of them. I'm sure we will once they're archived and online. So some of the highlights that you saw in terms of, or heard in terms of real innovations, creative approaches, advances, knowledge gaps, directions forward. So first, I'd appreciate your impressions on what you heard from the other presenters. And then relevant to that, I would like to, if you have anything, to speak from your own experience with reintroductions or other topics. And then after each person wraps up, we'll open it up for questions to the audience to that particular person. And then at the end, we'll open it up to questions from absolutely everybody for any or all of us. So let's start with Andrea. What did you hear these last couple of weeks that struck you, and what do you think about it?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. On the whole, I was really impressed by the diversity of all the talks and all the really, really hard work that's going into amphibian conservation around the world. So in addition to thanking Luis, I want to thank everyone who participated in presenting their work at this symposium. And this symposium is a great example of the kind of information sharing that we need a lot more of so that we can learn from each other's mistakes and successes. So I noticed a lot of focus on temperature and climate, especially as those relate to disease outcome. So, as far as innovation, some folks are even working on maximizing climatic refuges to try to alter disease outcome. And I feel like in some ways that's, as it relates to amphibian translocations, that's kind of a new frontier. So for example, the Mountain Chicken Frog project was using enclosures with artificially solar power basking sites to try to affect disease outcome. I just thought that was a really great innovative approach. So related to temperature and climate, we were reminded by Trent Garner that a very important point about communicating our science as it relates to climate change is that to be sure that that we're clear that not all amphibian species are necessarily going to be negatively affected. So for example, when we're looking at the effects of temperature and climate on amphibians, it's important to do so mindfully and be sure that we're identifying the biological mechanisms that are behind the effects that we're observing. So with some of my work in Central California, we noticed that BD outcome, or chytridiomycosis outcome, was related to drought, and it was actually related to cooler temperatures rather than warmer temperatures, because the cooler temperatures were moving the BD envelope, or sorry, the cooler temperatures are moving the frogs into this sort of BD optimum window. And as Luke Linhoff pointed out in the first session, a lot of the progress in amphibian translocation work has been front-loaded in the earlier ex situ stages. And so this is, of course, an essential part of this kind of work. But as Luke pointed out, there's also a lot more work to be done at the reintroduction planning and post-release monitoring stages. So I was really encouraged to see what's being done at these stages, because there's so much trial and error work that goes into post-release monitoring, even down to optimizing mark recapture and radio tracking techniques. So for example, with the Atelopus radiotelemetry study and mountain chicken frog releases, it was known that these species were probably going to succumb to chytridiomycosis, but researchers tried these projects anyway. And they learned a lot that they were able to take in the next phase of their projects, but also contributed significantly to this area of post-release research that other projects can use to inform their work. So I'm working on a telemetry study in Yosemite National Park right now, and there's, I could really relate to the Atelopus study. Like there's a lot of trial and error that goes into it, and making sure that the methods are dialed in. And so just to reiterate, I think this is another really great forum for this kind of thing, because this work isn't necessarily always going to make it into the academic papers. I feel like we need to be doing more methods papers on this kind of work so that other people, so that folks can learn from what other people are doing and how they're succeeding and the lessons learned. So, and just one final thing that I kind of took out of all of the talks was that I got this sense of this courage to try something, right? Kind of as an antidote to conservation paralysis. And so there is this balance between, wanting to be brave enough to try something, but also needing to have the proper amount of planning beforehand. And so I just saw a lot of really great examples of projects that are making progress and moving forward, even when threats such as disease makes moving forward seem kind of hopeless. So a lot of the talk showed us that there is reason to hope, and these projects are moving the needle in the right direction.
That's great. I completely agree with you that I picked up on these themes of risk tolerance, aversion to conservation paralysis, which is one of my least favorite concepts in our business. And I like your use of the word courage. In my notes, I was using the word progressive or even aggressive. And you're right. A lot of this is trial and error, and this is not going to happen if these programs don't have institutional support that will accept some failures, some losses, some risk tolerance. That also needs to be worked out with the permit agencies. And then depending on the profile of the program, some of these programs are going to have fair amounts of media and press attention on them. And, the first round of release of frogs, if you have big press releases and everyone's all excited about it, and then 4 weeks later they've perished, it'd be good to plan for these things in advance. So the support of the institution, the permit agencies, all of the stakeholders in these things. So those programs you pointed out, the Atelopus, the mountain chicken, David Hunter's programs, and all that, I think they deserve a lot of credit for moving forward and trying some really outside the box things and realizing there's going to be some failures. Michelle, what did you hear? Oh wait, no, let's open that up for questions for Andrea, if there are any. Luis, how do we do that?
There is a Q&A box, and they can also raise the hand and just participate using their microphone. I'm browsing the names here in case anyone has a question, but can also be a comment. I mean, it's not just people teaching here, but people sharing and everybody learning from each other.
Okay, am I supposed to click that button?
You can click on our participants, and then you will see name of people attending. There is a question here. If you go to your banner, a black banner, there is a Q&A box, and there is one already.
Okay, I'm having trouble navigating this.
It is from Vicky Pool, and so far it says, while Joe was speaking to conservation paralysis, what about exit strategies? Those need to be included.
Andrea, what do you think about that?
I don't think I'm clear on the question. I feel like I need more. Joe, are you getting what he's getting at? I think. Oh, exit strategies as far as like try it. I guess I'm not clear on the question.
Okay, my understanding of it is having clear exit strategies to deal with. I can look at that in two ways. One is another theme that I picked up on that we haven't brought up yet, which is the importance of setting clear goals.
Yeah.
I agree with Vicky completely that part of setting clear goals for success also includes setting clear goals for failure and when it's time to cut your losses. And I think that is a crucial part of the planning that people sometimes naively, because of optimism and hope, themselves to do that. And sometimes I think it simply gets overlooked. So I couldn't agree more strongly with Vicky that part of goal setting and risk tolerance is identifying failure and when it's time to let this program go. So yeah, thanks Vicky for bringing that up. That's very important.
Yeah, and I can add that for the amphibian arc, that's kind of in the planning process, it will be kind of reverse planning. So what is your exit strategy? And then you work from there. Because you can have a program for translocation, as we have been talking about it during this last 15 days, or you can have just a program for producing enough animals to put it in the pet trade or so on. So you need to have clear understanding of what is the purpose of your program, and then do the plan around it.
Yeah, good points. Good points, definitely. Are there other questions coming in?
There is an additional comment from Vicky.
Oh yeah.
It says,
she says, why do we never plan for financial self-sufficiency when it comes to long-term programs? How do we also include efforts for independence of programs, especially those that we support in other regions or countries? So as far as the financial part, I feel like that's also a really important part of just following up on what Joe and Luis were already saying, is that there is this really critical component of making sure that planning ahead of time, and when it comes to agencies. So I used to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and when we develop a recovery plan for the species, we're required to quantify to the best of our ability exactly how much we think taking the species off the U.S. endangered species list is going to cost. And when you're talking about recovering a species in 75 years, that gets really challenging. And so I think part of it is that it's not that we never try to plan for financial self-sufficiency, but as I think some of the panelists are going to talk about later, a successful program usually is really long-term, and the longer term that it is, the harder that it gets to be able to plan for the financial aspects of that as well. As someone who used to work for the government, that fluctuates a lot. The amount of funding that's available fluctuates a lot depending on what's going on in the world. And so I think part of it is that it's challenging, but I agree that it's definitely a very important goal, because what's the point of having a 25-year monitoring program if you can only fund it for the next 5? Joe, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the countrywide, or what I'll call federal agencies, whether it be in any country, not just U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I think they're the most stable of any of these. So I think you were saying, how it's going to be difficult to schedule your funding with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 12 years down the road, 20 years down the road. Now let's put that in the realm of a small to medium or even a large NGO or a zoo or a state or local wildlife agency. And I mean, I don't have the solution. I would say that they simply don't have the ability to do that. And so then I think you wind up in this really difficult situation is like, do I start this and hope I can continue? Do we, no one does it by themselves, do we start this program and hope that we can keep funding it years down the road? And 25 years are the same people usually aren't going to be involved. So there's a long-term stability that even goes beyond funding into just the stability of the organizations involved. As I said, that when they're federal conservation or fish and wildlife agencies, I think there's more stability than probably virtually anywhere else, whether it be Conservation International or a large zoo or a small zoo or a small NGO or what have you. I think Vicky's absolutely right to point that out, but I wish people need to think about that, but I wish that there was a solution. I don't know what it is though.
Yeah, so this is Michelle, and I'm just going to jump in here because this conversation has touched on several things that I wanted to speak to. One of them is I think it's we're kind of in this feedback loop where, you know, we want all the planning and we want all of the kind of ducks in a row before we start a program, but at the same time, this overwhelming need of these huge planning and monitoring initiatives is what causes the conservation paralysis. And so it's this, you know, it's this back and forth of trying to find the middle ground of how do you implement conservation recovery when the upfront need is so great to, you know, you want to understand everything before you jump in, and you want to have security that you can keep moving forward because you know it's a long-term process. You know it's going to take at least 20 years to recover a species, and you don't have that information to plan out 20 years. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't actually try to start your program. And I think one of the key messages that I heard that I really wanted to highlight was that we should start small. Like, these programs should start small, and there's a lot of value in starting small because you know, it helps kind of test proof the idea, and it helps kind of get things going. It helps with the partnerships, which was the other thing that I really wanted to bring up in this. You know, coming from the partners in amphibian reptile conservation, I really wanted to highlight partnerships in this overall symposium. It was sprinkled through, I think, probably every single talk we heard, that these types of efforts require partnerships and teams. And really, it's the adage, you know, many hands make light work. In that, so if you start small, you can start building your coalitions and start building that community around this program, the translocation program, whatever that looks like. And then you start bringing in the people that have the expertise and the needs, or in the areas that you need for your program. So there was like a whole bunch kind of packaged in there, but I really wanted to get at yes, it's important to plan, and yes, it's very important to look at the risks, but to also get at this conservation paralysis. And one solution to that is to start small and to start building your community of practitioners around that small initiative.
I think a great example of that was in the talk that I saw by John Mayers and Robert Hill on the dusky gopher frog. I think that project has more partners than it has ponds. And if I remember the details right, they literally are working with 2 ponds and slowly expanding to a 3rd, and with not only a good number of partners, but a good variety of types of partners, including state agencies and universities and zoos. So I think that's an example of what you're talking about. And yeah, I think your points are really, really strong. Luis, is there another question or comment out there from Vicky or anybody else?
No. Okay. No, well, Vicky said the succession planning is what you are looking for when you were talking about a long-term plan. So if someone retire or whatever, someone else is in charge of the program now. So
Succession planning. I like, to be honest, I didn't have that word on my brain. I really like it. That's exactly what I was talking about, and that's exactly what it should be called. Yep. Thank you for that, Vicki. I didn't have that term in my brain. Michelle, you were on a roll. Let's hear more of what you were hearing or thinking.
Sure. Yeah. So actually, there's another comment in the chat box that I think also kind of goes through some of these things that I was thinking about. And so it says, a conceptual question. In the light of climate change, we might expect to lose a lot more unique habitats with unique species. Many amphibians have limited geographical distributions too, and thus, if their habitat is lost and recovery is not immediately possible, do you think it's worth the effort and the funding to keep the species ex situ? What is the value of a species out of its natural environment? And that actually kind of gets to another thing I was thinking about. So animals are brought into these ex situ situations because of extreme situations and circumstances. You know, really they're brought in trying to prevent extinction, this permanent loss. And how do we get from the ex situ to in situ recovery for those animals or for those species? And it can be daunting, you know, to like, you've got these animals and they're like almost the last of the last, and what do we do with them, and how do we go from having some animals in cages to building a partnership around recovering them in the wild? And I think that's what this symposium is really useful for, in trying to get at some of the tools, some of the lessons learned, how to reach out to people to you know, start transitioning from ex situ to in situ recovery.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a philosophy in that comment about, you know, let's be careful about what we're achieving here. I wrote an essay that came out last year about that, called Frogs in Glass Boxes, where I tried to make the point, I don't know how effective I was, that with the examples like the commenter pointed out, with small ranges and geographic shifts in climate and these sorts of things, we could wind up in situations where these animals are safe in glass boxes, but they really have no place to be returned to. And I posed the question, but not the answer. It's like, okay, is that a success? What is that? It's almost like dinosaur de-extinction in reverse. It's like, oh, we have it. Now what? Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but to your other point, more optimistically, how do we get from ex situ to in situ? I think that's what excited me most about this symposium that Luis assembled, is that was a point in my experience of conservation paralysis for years with ex situ programs, where the first line in any ex situ program planning is that can the threat be mitigated? Has the threat been mitigated? And when the situation of BD, the answer always was no. So what does that mean? It means you don't do anything. And collectively, when I look back, 15 years ago when we were talking about some of this stuff, no one ever said no. They just did it anyway, developed these ex situ programs without the assurance that these threats can be mitigated. Yeah. So here we are in 2019. We heard all these very forward-thinking thoughts that, instead of being paralyzed about the fact that we can't let these frogs go because they're just going to die, we can't reintroduce them. We had these, we had all these talks of going, let's think around the problem. Yes, we can't mitigate BD. That doesn't mean we can't do anything. And that's where that courage came in. And that's the part that impressed me the most. This symposium would not have sounded like this 15 years ago. There, I'm done with my monologue. Michelle.
No, those are all great points, and I completely concur with everything you just said. And I think that's, for me, one of the big take homes that I would like to see out of this symposium, is that there are a lot of people working on a lot of different programs and strategies, and there's a lot of lessons learned that can be shared, and that it does take courage, and it takes planning, and it takes risk assessment and analysis, but you don't have to have all the answers, and you don't have to have all of the uncertainty accounted for before you start kind of trying to take action. And it's scary because, you know, when you're working with rare species, or you're working with, you know, critically endangered species, or you're working with, once you make a decision, there's no going back. You know, once you know, mix populations and you've mixed their genes, they're mixed. And so it's scary taking those leaps. But if you use, you know, the best science that's available to us, and you talk to the experts, and you make as informed decisions as you can, and you start small, and you work together with all the stakeholders to move forward, then I think there are paths forward.
Yeah, so these words we keep, I'm making a list here, these words we keep settling on are courage, planning, partnerships, and I'd like to suggest adding another one, and that's creativity.
Yes.
Which I think has to come before the courage. Creativity is to come up with something really kind of different, you know? And so we heard about some inoculations and mountain yellow-legged frogs. We heard about the, in Australia with the corroboree frog, where they have these, what they're calling in situ nurseries. So essentially protected environments in the wild. And that's kind of an interesting concept. And
yeah. So to that, I didn't get to kind of talk about it during the symposium, but in New Mexico for Chiricahua leopard frogs, we did something similar where we have these semi-wild refugia tanks. And initially it was because we were losing all of our populations in the wild, and we didn't know how to stop it from BD. And so we took some of those animals, cleared them of BD, and put them in these steel rim tanks, and put some fencing around it, and basically reproduced, or kind of reestablished that same kind of population in this semi-wild, self-sufficient outdoor environment, where we didn't have to do anything. We just kind of fenced them off. And it proved super successful because A, it was low cost, B, we secured populations that were kind of disappearing off the landscape, and some of those populations did disappear off the landscape, and what we had left was in our refugia tanks. But then as we kept going with the program, they turned into a source for our translocation efforts. And so we could take egg masses from these sites and put them back out into actual real wild sites. So anyway, you know, real brief kind of piece of that, but again, it was out of the box thinking, and it was successful for us.
that's fantastic. I didn't know you guys had done that. Yeah, so that whole concept is I just find it just incredibly creative. That's the word for how you guys and our Australian colleagues and other people that might not be aware of are thinking. Anyone else comments on Michelle's comments so far, or more from Michelle? Are there other questions in the queue?
Not right now.
Okay, Sally, what were your thoughts? What do you think?
Really, a lot of my thoughts just build on what the other panelists have been saying about like the need to have a good plan, but it doesn't have to be set in stone. It can be flexible. It can involve adaptive management, where you're answering questions along the way to deal with the uncertainty. There were some really nice examples in the talks where experiments had been used to refine techniques, like in the dusky gopher frog, they'd done experiments on the number of tadpoles per tank and how that affected the quality of the metamorphs and the temperatures of the tanks as well. So it's really nice to see that science-based conservation where the experiments are able to properly inform the techniques. Just coming back to the funding and long-term funding issue, I come from the NGO world, and that's always an issue there, where you feel like you're fighting for funds all the time to try and implement projects. But I really think it helps the kind of things that we've talked about having the long-term collaborations and really good quality collaborations between several different partners. And that's something that a funder really likes to see, is that you've got individuals and partnerships in place that can deal with all of the aspects of a project. And also like having that really good quality plan, which doesn't just plan for the ex situ part, but also involves the in situ aspects. And again, we saw some great examples of that. Like one that springs to mind was the Valchetta frog, where they're doing brilliant habitat restoration and extermination of invasive species at the site. And I think that really supports your funding applications when you've got that quality holistic plan in place, and you can speak, even if you might be trying to get money just for the ex situ bit, you can say, and this is all the other stuff that's going on and what it's working towards. These are our aims. And if you've got all those goals and factors clearly laid out, then that can really help with getting the funding in the long term. Let me just look at my notes. Something else that I was looking at was there was that great talk from Ari Hoffman about the genetics, and but I feel like in a lot of situations we don't have the capacity to do that really in-depth analysis. But I saw nice methods where, for example, with the white-bellied frog in Australia, the established protocol was to only take 1 egg mass per male territory, and something simple like that is really good to try and maintain that genetic diversity. So even when you don't have that really full analysis going on, you can just use your knowledge of the biology of the species to help with that. And just coming back to my own experience, I feel like actually I was amazingly impressed with the level of monitoring that I saw in a lot of these talks, and that's not something, again, that you necessarily always have the capacity to do. And something that I think about a lot is just, if you've got those clear goals in your plan, then you can just plan your monitoring to really answer those questions. And it doesn't necessarily have to be really in depth. Like, to have that kind of mark recapture level is amazing. But if what you really need to know is breeding happening at the release site, or can we record more wild-born individuals than released individuals, that will tell you that there's really good quality breeding going on, then you can kind of plan your monitoring to really just answer those questions that you're trying to ask. And that's something that I think about with my own work. And my final point would be, I would just love, like, this is an amazing forum to have communicated all of these results. And I think that's something that we just need to do more of, is communicating the results of the projects, things that we've tried, especially when it's all these amazing innovative ideas and things that other groups might not have thought of. And this is a brilliant forum to do that, but we need to just continue doing that down the road and make sure that we're all stay aware of what other people are doing, and keep communicating those results.
Thanks for that. Well, to the last point first, I strongly suspect AmphibianArk will be sponsoring more events like this, using this framework and forum and method that Luis has put together, because, and what I'm especially excited about is a lot of people watch these in real time, but they're all going to be archived onto probably a YouTube page. And then I hope and anticipate that the viewership will just skyrocket, because, you know, these won't be outdated for a long time, in which case we can have new events like this, because this wasn't expensive, and a subset of entitled people didn't have to fly somewhere around the world to have this experience. So I'm very excited about all of that. To your other point, the experimental approach, obviously I'm a strong proponent of that. And some points that came up was during, checking a name here, Jesse Bushell's talk on Sierra Nevada yellow-legged frogs. I don't know if she made this point or not, but a number of people made the point of reintroductions using combination of life stages. So don't focus your reintroduction program just on metamorphs or just on translocations of eggs or these sorts of things, to use a combination of approaches. And when Sally was talking, it occurred to me, it's like, okay, I get my stomach agrees with using a combination of life stages in a reintroduction program, but I wonder how much of that has been researched. And I'm sure it's somewhere in these talks that I haven't seen them all yet. And that gets to the point of that I think Jesse Burchell brought up, is specifically this idea: are we growing the best possible frogs? And a couple of key papers over the past, probably now 8 years, that have really gotten my attention. One was by Bob Lacey, who's one of our speakers, and the other is by a guy's name who I can't remember. But they looked at very carefully in both mice and fisheries, salmon fisheries, how a lot of ex situ breeding programs can unknowingly and unwittingly and remarkably quickly select for captive vigor. And those might not be the ones you want to be releasing. We could use a lot more work on that in amphibians, but when the precedent shows that in fish and mammals, and how quickly and how many generations, captive generations, that can happen, that's, since I've read those papers, I've had problems with that. And in my own attempt at creativity is trying to think a way around to really reduce the captive breeding side, maybe not the captive component, but the captive breeding, captive raising side, with those papers in mind. So I would recommend people look for those papers. If I get a minute, I will figure out who wrote remember the guy's name who wrote the salmon papers, but Robert Lacey wrote the one on Permiscus mice. But anyway, Burchell was talking about behavioral assays to look for the more vigilant frogs. I don't know if that was her word or not. And I know Luke Linhoff has done some preliminary trials along those lines too. So something to think about, bringing the experimental approach to informing what life stages you're reintroducing. And also, I like the idea of seeing if we can come up with some kind of an assay for determining what are the better frogs. It seems an elusive goal, but I like the creativity behind it.
Yeah, similarly to that, Joe, is we had a similar experience with our Chiricahua leopard frogs as well. And in captivity, they were super sensitive to density, and so the tadpoles had to be reared at low density. Otherwise, you could literally just see the differences. They were smaller. Sometimes they developed kind of issues in their development because they were so densely, and they weren't even that densely in the rearing bins. They weren't that dense, but they were sensitive to being in close quarters, and they didn't seem to thrive under artificial lights and artificial food. And that was when we started exploring some of these alternatives. And we actually developed Turner Endangered Species Fund is one of our partners, and they have an outdoor renarium. And so again, it seems like the closer you can get it to natural situations, the better off. So they breed outside, the tadpoles are then reared outside, or we just take the egg masses directly and release those, because the tadpoles will probably do better off in the wild than in captivity. And so strategies to improve the natural selection of the animals that survive is trying to get them out as quickly as possible, but changing the strategies of what stage we release is also part of it. Unfortunately, we don't have good monitoring and we have a very small site. So our monitoring is more like if the animals are successful, if there's breeding at a site, and not intensive monitoring to know the difference between the different kind of life stages and success of those outcomes of how they were reared or when they were moved and released. But yeah, so I think thinking about those things, and if we could get some studies to really look at kind of, some different species and different strategies, I think that would be really great. And there is, they're in Arizona, I think they are looking at their long-term data, 30 years worth of release data, to see if they can find patterns in success, if there are greater successes with different life stages.
So just to fill people in, when you said Arizona, you were referring to the Chiricahuas.
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The Owens and Cat Crawford.
So, yeah. Audrey and Kat that gave that presentation. I think they touched on it, but I don't know if they really spoke to it.
Yeah, they touched on it. Yeah, they did. I saw that particular one. So a thought project for everybody here. Let's go back to your situation with these tanks of frogs that are very sensitive to overcrowding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your guys' approach to that was to lose the tanks, essentially, right? Get them outside.
Yeah, and we reduce the density as well. Yeah.
Let's think about what it would mean if you think of a typical ex situ captive breeding program where that problem was solved, where by changing something in the captive environment, the animals were now thriving in densities that they previously wouldn't thrive particularly well in, right? One side might see that as an ex situ husbandry break.
Win. Yeah.
But I think you see where I'm going, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah.
This concept of captive vigor could also say, you just created an artificial lab frog and you're calling it a success because you maybe are looking at the wrong metric of success.
Yep.
So that's, I think that a husbandry challenge might be exactly where people could unwittingly fall into that trap.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. And especially too, when you don't know if, like, are they losing something in terms of being evasive and they're, easier targets for predation. There's a lot of pieces in there.
Yeah, exactly. So that's I just throw that out there as a not a warning, but something for people to think about, especially when they're trying to solve ex situ problems. Like, be careful you're not creating a lab monster, especially if reintroductions are in order.
Yeah, and I think it's also it could be a tendency for ex situ to raise the biggest animals in as short a period of time as possible, and that might not be to the benefit of those animals. It might not lead to a better, more successful releasable animal, just because they're bigger. So size is not necessarily the measure either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect example.
Yeah.
We haven't heard from you in a bit. Do you have comments at this point? Oh, maybe we lost her.
Sorry, I heard you say that, but did you say that to me specifically?
We haven't heard.
Sorry, I didn't. I heard you say that, but I didn't hear my name at the beginning of it. So yeah, I think that's a really good point about the hybrid vigor, and I know I don't want to steal any of Jessie Bichel's thunder. So she talked about the red-legged frogs that we've introduced to the Yosemite Valley. So she was raising them at the San Francisco Zoo, and we actually gave them, Jessie gave them these inoculation treatments to see what their, for those who missed the talk, to see what their response would be to BD, and also see if they could mount an adaptive immune response. So those are the animals that we're currently monitoring in the field. And I know that Jessie did do some, she talked about the behavioral studies that they did with those frogs. And, I kind of, in the zoo, and it did kind of have us wondering after we released them, because some animals, when you first release them, some of the animals don't immediately seek cover. And so it sort of raises this question, like, well, if it's been in a zoo its entire life and that's all it's ever known, like, are these animals really prepared for the wild? And so how that's something that Jessie's interested in doing further with more research, is looking at, how can we sort of like train the frogs to be better prepared for the wild in the zoo, giving them these other behavioral trials so that they're, so that they can handle the wild better, so they're better at evading predators. And, if a big shadow comes over them, they should probably move, kind of thing. So, I think that, I think that's a really big, important point. And I think it's a really exciting, when we're talking about this, like, sharing information and having these releasing these animals that were raised from eggs, you know, ex situ. Like, what are these considerations that we need to make? So I think it's another really great creative sort of new direction that came out of the symposium.
Sally, what do you think about all that? Have you run across these sorts of ideas in your programs?
The ones that I'm involved with are all wild-to-wild translocations, so haven't involved that captive element, but it did make me think about the Hellbender talk that we saw. And they had struggled with survival when taking them from captivity into the wild. And I believe that was even a head starting program, so it wasn't necessarily that they had bred to be captive monsters. But even maybe the survival and their behavior as they grew in captivity just didn't allow them to make that transition back into the wild smoothly. And yeah, that speaks to trying to ensure that they get these cues. And I think I've read papers with other Hellbender projects where they're trying to get them more predator aware and things like that before releasing them. And I think that's a lesson that we can learn from that.
Yeah, I know some of the Hellbender programs and some other programs they're doing, you know, what most people call a soft releases. And I know some of the Hellbender programs, although I don't know about all of them, have the animals outside, not in situ outside like Michelle was talking about, or like the Australians, David Hunter were talking about, but at least outside. So yeah, I think that whole realm of assessing quality and being cognizant of and vigilant towards captive vigor, I think are directions I would suggest that people might want to focus on moving forward. Let me look at the time here. Luis, first of all, do we have any questions or comments at this point?
No, yet there is no question right now or comment. As far
Okay. Luis, you heard all of these talks. I really want to hear your opinions.
Yeah, it amazed me as someone else said before, the variety of talks and the different approach everybody is doing. And so this kind of forum, I think, is a really good forum again to share those experiences, and especially when you fail. So I really I like it, all of the talks, and but I especially like it, or I want to portray the planning part. And one of the talk I remember, they spend a little time on their talk was the pickergill reed frog in South Africa, where they show us all the plan they have done previous the attempt of breeding the animals in captivity and so on. And on that same talk, referred to the comment on habitat loss. If you guys remember, they show an aerial picture, and the frog was living right there in the middle of the city, but still they put a lot of effort on recovering that species because it was listed in their government, or for their government, but also they wanted to give the frog a chance to live or to survive or to thrive in the nature. So and of course the programs presented by people from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where you have a list species and you are required to have a thorough plan. Those were really good, I think, in terms of planning. Or I'm sure everybody had a plan for their program, but they portrayed the plan, and I really like that. Also, everybody at the end of the presentation, and I think someone, I think it was Andrea, talked about this, about partnerships. And at the end of each presentation, we saw a lot of different logos from different organizations working on this, on a particular project. And of course, you cannot do everything. You may have the potential of keeping the animals in your zoo, aquarium, museum, institution, or whatever. But then you need people also to be working in the field, trying to mitigate the threat, understand in many cases the threat, because in many cases we don't even understand well what is going on in the wild. So I think that's really important. And also I really like it, and Blake is here, and if I understood well, they use Limosus as a surrogate species, and do experiments in the wild with that one, and then they apply the information gained and the experience gained with the Telopus sedeki trials too. So I think it was a really good thing for me to watch. And what else? Something important for us is the biosecurity. And when you were talking a few minutes ago about having animals outside and so on, and that's perfect, because I also think that will benefit the species, but always having or taking care of the biosecurity. If you are in the range area of the species, or you are somewhere else where your species can be exposure to something else, or you can be in exposure in your local species to a new pathogen or novel pathogen or something like that. So biosecurity is really important. I think one of the talks portraying that was the mountain chicken one, because they were dealing with a species which were not from Europe, and they brought it from the Caribbean all the way to Europe and bred them there and then send it back. So it was two ways biosecurity trouble if there is a breach on that thing. So, but in general, all the talks were really good, really good, and I take the chance right now to thank all the presenters. There are not all of them are right here or right now here, but I want to thank them in public. Some of them I don't know personally. I know their names. I have been corresponding with them by email, but they were super enthusiastic in collaborating with this kind of symposium. So I think that's the main points I wanted to say.
Your biosecurity points are of course important and dead on. I wonder, and maybe in New Zealand, Sally's been involved with some of these, but these assisted migrations outside the historical range of the species. I think it was Michael McFadden was talking about some of that in Australia. That's because Luis was making reference to, within the range, and that's always been one of the Amphibian ARC mantras, is like, keep these programs within the range of the species. Not always possible, not always advisable, but it just simplifies biosecurity a lot. But here, these programs are purposefully going outside the range of the species. And in the case of Michael McFadden's talk, I believe it was to avoid a reservoir species that they just could not control BD in. So that, obviously those groups have thought through this, but it strikes me as like, oh, okay, I'd have to really think about the biosecurity implications of an outside the range assisted migration. I've not been involved with one. Sally, do you wind up bumping into those issues?
It's not something that I've personally been involved with, but definitely something that we think about, and especially because the translocations that I've been studying here in New Zealand are all to predator-free islands, because the invasive mammalian predators are the main issue. And right. We talk a lot about how that doesn't give the species room for movement in the face of something like climate change. and maybe we do need to start thinking about trying to get them somewhere where they've got that ability to move if the climate does change. And yeah, it's definitely something that we discuss a lot and, and try and think about in terms of planning any future translocations.
The in terms of courage, obviously these programs that that you guys are doing onto the islands and these programs in Australia, these are being approved by governments that I've always perceived to be pretty conservative in terms of appropriately conservative in terms of conservation. So I'm just intrigued. I'm just curious about how controversial some of this is. Andrea and Michelle, I'm trying to imagine, do you think if it was a good idea, you think we could get permission to establish a colony of chiricahua or leopard frogs in West Texas?
Well, that's a loaded question.
Michelle can give the official answer, and I can give the unofficial answer.
Yeah, no, my answer is actually unofficial as well, and it would probably be more of, it's all, again, I'm going to bring it back to the partnerships, because it's really all about developing those relationships. And if the stakeholder team that's working on this problem and the need for the species comes to agreement that the science supports, a introduction outside of the historical range of the species, I think anything's possible in terms of how you move forward, but you have to make sure that the right people are at the table. So the states and the Fish and Wildlife Service offices and all the other stakeholders, that everybody's there. So again, it's not I know I'm avoiding your question about whether or not it would get approved or not, but I think that, as we move forward into the future in light of climate change, I think we're going to have to start thinking about novel approaches to conservation, and this could be one approach on the table. But again, I think you have to have buy-in, and you have to have science that supports those decisions.
I don't think I can think of a better example of the importance of a diversity of partnerships than what you just described. That's how you're going to get something like that approved without a controversial explosion in your hands, is by having all the stakeholders be partners.
Yep.
And that's just a perfect example of why that is. We have a question on the board. I finally found the question button, people. But Andrea, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, before we get to Laura's question, I just wanted to add something to that, because the project that I'm working on now is actually a good example of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service approving a conservation introduction outside of the range of an amphibian species.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, so the California red-legged frog is, the history of the California red-legged frog in the Yosemite Valley is not 100% certain, and because the Yosemite Valley's been managed by humans for so long, and so the full amphibian history of the valley there's still a little bit that remains unclear. But the information available now says that there are no records of the California red-legged frog in the Yosemite Valley, and interestingly, I won't go through the whole story. Hopefully I get a chance to tell it in another venue, but it's a really interesting story because the California red-legged frogs couldn't be introduced until the invasive bullfrogs were eradicated, and until a prominent person in the Park Service decided that they wanted red-legged frogs in the Yosemite Valley, because it's the California state amphibian and because it's an endangered species. There wasn't any effort to eradicate the bullfrogs, but once someone of importance wanted red-legged frogs in the valley, the effort to remove the bullfrogs was undertaken. They were eradicated in 2015, and the red-legged frogs started to be introduced in 2016. And they're there now. So that's the project that I'm monitoring them on, and and the service was pretty behind it. And from what I've gathered, I was able to see a lot of sort of email exchanges about it, and their sense was that it's, if anything, it could potentially be a climatic refuge for the species. It's a perfect example of conservation translocation, where it is being put in a place that isn't necessarily part of the historic range, but it has conservation value. And I think the important part of this story with this species specifically was that until there was really kind of like the political will to support this endangered species in this particular habitat, the removal of the will to remove the invasive species, the bullfrog, that's a BD reservoir and a predator and competitor of native amphibians, just wasn't there. And so it kind of like opened this doorway to help not only this species, but all the other aquatic species in the community as well.
I didn't know the details of that program. I knew what you were doing, but I didn't know that backstory. I always find it frustrating, even if I like the outcome of something, I always find it frustrating that what made it happen was the political will of one important person. That flies in the face of diversity of stakeholder opinion and partnerships like we were just talking about, doesn't it? It sounds like that's what drove this one. Even if I like the outcome, sometimes I don't like the process by which we got there. We have a question from Laura Patterson. You touched on it already, but I'd like to hear more of your thoughts or recommendations for more reading on what goes into the decision-making of when to mix populations or not, like a genetic rescue approach through wild translocations or captive breeding first and then reintroduction. Quickly, the first thing comes to mind for me was the talk by Diane Barber on the Puerto Rican crested toad, where she went through, and obviously it was a talk, she didn't get all the details, but if you contacted her, you could get all the details. She went through the logic behind their ultimate decision to mix the northern and southern populations, which were, by my understanding, genetically identifiable and separated, and that decision was made. So I would point Laura to Diane Barber for more on that, and there's a paper by Richard Frankham et al. About 2016 that talks a bit about this. And it kind of takes the, flips this on its side and talks about how we can get into situations where we get all hung up on the genetic uniqueness of an isolated population and maybe forget our basic population genetics class, where you start to realize like, oh, it's this human-induced isolation that probably made this genetically unique. And so that gets you in a complete catch-22. It's like, well, we can't mix them because they're different. It's like, well, maybe they're different because we isolated them. So that paper touches on that. It's not an easy paper to read, but I would point Laura to Diane Barber, and then also this paper by Richard Frankham in one of the conservation journals, maybe Conservation Biology, I don't remember, about 2016. Other comments on that from other folks for Laura?
So there's the genetic part of Laura's question, but I see another part of Laura's question as a manager, which is what goes into the decision making of, she's asking specifically about the genetics, but I think she's also asking about, where are the tools for how to take ourselves through these decision-making processes, right? Because ultimately it comes down to a decision. We have these papers that we can back up, that we can base our decisions on, and there are a series of decisions that need to be made when implementing a conservation translocation program. And so I think that this is actually a critical need, is having more of these structured, formal decision-making approaches, so that when a manager like Laura has a question like this, they can say, okay, this is the information that I have. What are the logical next steps that we can go through for this? And so Evan Grant has done a lot of work with this, with structured decision-making, and there are actually a couple of papers in the recent biological conservation issue over the summer that Joe, that your paper was in. There was a really great special issue specifically on amphibians, and there were a few structured decision-making framework, at least 2 structured decision-making framework papers for amphibian conservation in there. So I would direct people toward that special issue. And then Laura says, yeah, how do we convince our managers to be bold, the risk-benefit analysis? Yeah, and I think that's part of it. That comes back to the partnerships. I think when you're developing a structured decision-making approach, you need to include all of the partners, because the decision comes down to not only the genetics and not only the biology, but the goals of all of the other partners as well. And so I think that's a really huge gap, and that's something that's really needed, and that's also part of the next frontier. So I'm glad that people touched on it in that biological conservation special issue. I think it was July, right?
Yeah, I just wrote on my my summary sheet here a need box, and I would argue that because I'm a little bit naive on the topic, I would be interested to say, especially in light of the development of these structured decision-making methodologies, where is the literature right now on how to assess, to put it very crudely, when to mix, when not to mix? Where is the literature on that? And what's the status? And would an online symposium like this one be advisable, reaching out beyond the amphibian people, because other people certainly must be facing this, both in conservation and theoretically. I'm just a little bit ignorant on the topic. So yeah, good points, Laura. Thanks for bringing those up. We are about at the hour, a little bit over actually, teeny bit over. Any final wrap-up comments? I think we should wind up here. We don't seem to have any other questions after Laura's.
Joe, there is someone, Edgar Griffith, with a hand raised. So I'll let him do his comment or question.
Did you say there is another question?
I say there is, Edgardo Griffith is wanted to make a comment or a question. He's going to speak.
Oh, okay.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Well, I just want to say that thank you, Luis, and thank you, Amphibian AArk, and all the responsible people involved in organizing this fantastic symposium. Definitely a need, and it's a great way to restart the conversation about amphibian conservation. But and I don't want to be that person, but I feel that there's one thing, one topic that we need to include in the future conversations, and that is based on, when I got involved, and Joe, when was this? In 2005 when we started the ARCC project. That there were some mandates basically from Amphibian AArk and amphibian specialist groups and all that creating local capacity was a fundamental aspect of amphibian conservation due to the crisis. And this is directly related with, are we doing the right thing? Like keeping frogs in captivity. Yeah, somebody at some point said that putting frogs in glass cages wasn't conservation. But at the same time, that was the only option we had since we were in basically a crisis. And the thing is that I think that international organizations, NGOs like IUCN and such should play a bigger role into making the local, once that local capacity is created, making that local capacity be reinforced into the decision-making process. Because in Panama case, and this is the right, I think we have enough to create a case study on this, and Joe, I'll take you on this one, to work together so we help other folks so the same mistakes that we've made don't happen again. And just one example is that we created with the partnership with the Houston Zoo, we created a facility to help local species, especially a Panamanian golden frog, which is not just significantly important from the point of view of genetics, but also culturally important. And that facility was created, and the program was started, and with no real goal towards the end. We were always in that crisis mode, and we never really achieved the final goal, which was reintroducing the species within their natural range. And then recently we had to leave that facility. So all the effort that was put into this facility for over 13 years and over $1 million, we had to leave it and start again. And there we see that international organizations have more power making decisions towards the conservation of a local species than the local. And that is because when we started the project, and this is the real issue, that the local government has no governance within the conservation programs. And normally in countries like Panama, you have international organizations making the decisions about the conservation of the species of a country, which is a contradiction when you look at every single aspect of Amphibian AArk and IUCN. And I just want to bring that up because politics is as bad for amphibian, in this case amphibian conservation, as it is a pathogen like the BD. And that is more than, it's just a comment. I don't want to be the guy that's always, bringing this kind of topics up, but it's important that in the future, when we talk about amphibians and any other species or habitat, that the local capacity that's created, or if there's a desire at the local level, that should be taken into consideration at the moment of making decisions, and not just the international organizations have all the influence to make the decisions for the people of the country where the species is native.
Yeah, Edgardo, I think you just came full circle and emphasized with a very real example the challenges of long-term funding and succession planning, and making sure that the right partnerships are in place. And to your specific points, that all the partnerships have, equal is not always a good word for these situations, but all the partnerships have the appropriate voice at the table. You know what I mean?
Yep.
I think that the Panama case study is a perfect example of the importance of those issues.
Yep.
Yeah, excellent points, without a doubt. Any other wrap-up comments from anybody? Thank you, by the way, Edgardo, for calling in. That was more efficient than using the question box. Thank you. Any other wrap-up comments?
Just to respond a bit to that point in terms of the amphibian specialist group, something we've become increasingly aware of is the fact that our membership is really heavily leaning towards people from North America and Europe, and we actively want to try and recruit more members in countries where there are like a high species richness of threatened amphibians, and that's something that we are aware of and that we are trying to tip towards the other way, so that our membership more reflects local people working in those regions, and we can have a better avenue of communication with those people as well for decision making and things like that.
Yeah, on the same point, Richard Griffith and Gemma, they mentioned that the new programs are mostly in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and most of the programs in the US and Europe are the number are decreasing. So trying to cope with that, we have been investing a lot of effort in the last 10 years, trying to bring capacity in those areas. So I think so far we have around, with our partners, around 70 training courses in different areas. So we are trying to build the capacity in those countries where there is more need.
All right, let's wrap up. Thank you to Andrea Adams, Michelle Christman, Sally Wren, Luis Carrillo, and to our various questioners and caller in and such. And watch for announcements as Luis and Amphibian AArk work to get all of these talks on online and available for everyone. We don't have a time frame for that, but they all are recorded, and that will happen. So thank you, Luis, both for this and for the entire series, and thanks to our speakers.
Thanks to you guys. I just mentioned to the participants, and so again, thank you for all the speakers and all the attendees. So it was a wonderful audience, and I have been sent assessment for block 3 and 4 if you haven't had the chance to assess those blocks, and I will send a final assessment for the whole training or the whole symposium. It's not all of the talks, because I have done that in the previous ones. But your feeling about this, how can we improve these kind of symposiums and so on? So I'll be sending that shortly. And as Joe say, we will. I'm editing all of the talks, so I will be putting those out there either in our YouTube channel or in our Dropbox. So I'll keep you posted, and I will also sending you the list of instructors, so you can reach out them whenever you want or you need.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have enjoyed this, and be in touch with all of you.